It feels like an airport board meeting so far, right?
Hey, wait a
We've got,
second.
we've got airport people here.
We are not encumbered by the Brown Act or any kind of public notification process. Don't put that juju on us. We're philanthropy. We're flexible.
Exactly.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. All right. There's Mr. Wright. Good to see you. All right. I think we will go ahead and get started in the interest of time and let other folks join as they come. Welcome, everybody, to this Thursday afternoon final salon of the 2020 year for Forest Futures. It's been quite the year, and we're just so grateful for you to be here. I'm Stacy Caldwell. I am with the Tahoe Truckee Community Foundation, and joining me today from the Community Foundation, you will see Tamia Grisey and Caroline Craffey. See if there's anybody else I'm missing. And so I just want to first say thank you to those of you who have joined us throughout the year for this series. It's been a lot of fun. We definitely got just some real lift from our facilitators this year that I just want to recognize Teal and Robert, who will kind of continue to facilitate and host this program today after I do the intro. But these have just been so fun. Ttcf has been doing these for about 3 years now. And over the last 6 months with Robert and Teal shaping them, it's just taken it to a whole other level of content and expertise. And we're just really grateful to have their thought and attention to our salons. And it's just introduced us to a lot of new people in our network and in our community. So thank you to both of you. And so with that, I will go ahead and do our little intro. Some of you could probably do it for me, but for those of you who are joining for the first time, it just helps to know what Zoom you just arrived in. You found your people if climate action, forest stewardship and resilience, philanthropy, innovation, and basically the North Lake Tahoe community is your thing, all of them, whatever, you found your people. So with that, let's go ahead and just jump into this presentation, Tamia. And you can just keep rolling and I'll go as fast as you go. Okay, so TTCF's mission is to connect people and opportunities to generate more resources for a caring, creative, and effective community. Here you see our illustrious board members as well as staff team, all passionate about our mission. Many of you know us for our grant making and our scholarship work. That's kind of the meat and potatoes of most community foundations, but we also have initiatives in which we focus more on some of the tougher issues that take more than one organization to really solve them. Many of you on the call are part of our Mountain Housing Council. Our Strengthening Families work is really looking at the safety net organizations and supporting their needs. And today you're here with our Forest Futures effort. And then really the through line in all of these is how we apply the resources. And so impact investing is a new way, maybe not so new anymore, but for community foundations and foundations in general to really think about how to deploy all of their assets, their grants, their investments, and everything in between to advance impact in the region. Thank you. We have had a nature fund for over 10 years, so we're really familiar with the environmental organizations in our region and have written many grants to them over the years. Next slide. But we really wanted to dig deeper into the forest work, and we'll tell you why in a second. And so we've been hosting these salons that have featured a myriad of organizations doing great work in the forest, not only in our region, but also beyond. And so here you'll see what is a healthy forest. And we often say a healthy forest is one you can gallop a horse through. If you look at our community, you can see a lot of areas where you definitely can't even walk through it yourself. Next slide. And so we've seen changes happening not only in our region, but throughout all of California. Part of it, is just changing weather patterns. Part of it has to do with forest management and policy. Another part has to do with a lack of infrastructure to really process wood. And it's led us to high hazard zones, a lot of piles of dead wood surrounding us, and ultimately making it really difficult to live here, not only because of insurance drops, but also the threat of catastrophic wildfires. And let's face it, this year we've seen the worst fire season on record, and we're not out of the woods. Here are some of the numbers, and they're just fairly horrific. And we just keep coming back to this place of, if we could apply the same amount of funding, resources, activity, strategy to getting on the front end of these issues, we really believe that the costs, the human costs, the community costs, the financial costs would be significantly less. And so that brings us to the Community Foundation's role. First and foremost, we use this Salon series to bring people together, educate, and engage stakeholders. And I think you'll find, if you've been here now a few times, the conversation is deep, and it's sometimes technical, sometimes not. We want everybody at all places in this conversation to feel like they can ask questions and talk. But it's just been a wonderful forum to really identify those stakeholders and advance conversations. Mobilizing resources in this conversation. So, the Nature Fund continues to grow and produce grants. Oh, hello. We have a fund right now specific to this program that we continue to raise money for. And we're currently designing donor advised funds that will address some of this work, as well as exploring a venture fund that can advance the idea of market-based solutions for the forest, which we've been talking about now since bringing Robert on the team and Teal as well. And then finally, we're currently exploring the idea of a venture prize challenge for this work. And so that's where we've been. Some of it's a little further along than others, but that just gives you a snapshot of our role. Next slide. So in traditional Salon fashion, we pride ourselves on being one of the best networking opportunities in town, even on Zoom. And so what we would like to do is ask you an icebreaker of one thing that you plan to do in the forest this holiday season. There's so much to do, and introduce yourself, share your link, and we'll break out. And how long do we have, Tamia? 3 or 4 minutes?
About 7 to 9 minutes.
Okay. So yeah, get to know who's in the room. Think about it as a coffee break, and when we come back, we'll get into our program.
All right. Enjoy, everyone. You'll receive a 1-minute warning before the time's up.
Hi, Rob. Hi, Jim.
Good afternoon. This is Rob. Jim, Matt.
Hi, Rob.
Okay, I've unmuted. I'll say hi again.
How are you guys doing?
I'm doing all right. I guess the one question is what we're going to do in the forest over the holidays. And I guess I'll jump right in there and share that I'll be taking my two new little twin 6-month-old puppies. They aren't quite so small out in the forest, and getting them some good run time and maybe a little cross-country ski time if I can manage them on a leash with skis at the same time.
Sounds like a lot of fun. I can mention what I recently did in the forest, which was went to Avenue of the Giants in Humboldt Park up there, and that was the first time I've been there. So I really enjoyed seeing the.
Bear with me here for a second. Okay. Have fun.
Thanks.
Hi, Brittany.
Hi.
How are you?
You okay?
Yes. Everyone's in the breakout room session right now. We'll be ending in about less than 5 minutes. Would you want to join one or?
Yes, I was in breakout room 1, but I got a
you were.
notification that my microphone wasn't working, so I had to restart.
Oh, here, let me put you back in one.
Thank you.
I was wondering, I was like, wait a second, I thought I saw you before.
Thank you so much. See you soon.
I might be.
Hey, Tamia, how are you?
Hey, good. How are you, Megan?
Good, I'm good. I'm probably too late to join a breakout room, but I'll just say hello for a minute.
Okay, no worries. I'm just bringing everyone back in about a minute. So sorry.
No, I'm the one who's like late and multitasking today and all that kind of good stuff. So thank you for, I'll just be first in your group session.
Everyone's life nowadays, right? Multitasking.
I'm here. I did, now I got to do my like exercise, which is my only form of human interaction before the sun sets. So I have, I got to fit all these things in.
I hear you. I hear you.
Right? It's 2020. This is it.
Oh my God.
I know.
Just like, I'm just wondering what our brain's going to look like by the end of next year or in.
My ability to multitask, like I sort of multitask, but I'm not doing it well. I used to be much better at it. My ability to sustain a thought for any length of time. I don't know if this is permanent or just the, 8 months of low level anxiety.
Oh,
Yeah.
I hope it's the latter.
Me too.
First. It's not permanent.
Me too. We'll see.
How's your sister?
She's good. I just got off the phone with her. She told me today. She's like, I told my family that I have COVID and I'm in quarantine and not to come talk to me.
So wait. Is that true or just does she say?
I think so.
Okay. That's awesome.
Megan.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Hey, how y'all doing? It's
Hey, Megan.
the first group back. Good to see you guys.
You too. You too.
Lucky me, I had a one-on-one with Megan for like a second.
It feels like a full minute. We got like a full.
I know.
That's amazing.
4 seconds until everyone is joining.
Oh my gosh, we've increased in size. There we go. Hey, Hannah.
Holidays.
Hey, Megan. Oh, very good. Okay. Hopefully everybody had a chance to get to meet somebody new. We had a good conversation and I shared that my plans for being in the forest this holiday season is to live here because we are forest dwellers. So in addition to getting on the trails and the sports, we also get to just, live here, which is amazing. Those of us get to do that. All right, I see Robert has started the LinkedIn sharing, so feel free to put your LinkedIn. It's great. I mean, this is the way we network these days, right? So put your LinkedIn there if you'd like to. And for those of us we didn't get to meet everyone, it's nice to have. Okay, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Teal to facilitate the next portion of our programming, which is really what you're here for. And again, I just want to acknowledge both Teal and Robert for an amazing series. We've really enjoyed it, and looking forward to this final one with some of our local experts. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Stacy. Patrick, Steve, thank you for being here. I will be super brief in introducing you because in many ways I think neither of you need introduction. But both of you have been teachers and stewards to me in my foray into forest work. And both of you represent people who I think have one of the most all-encompassing systemic views to this challenge and the solutions in the pipeline. So we're extremely privileged to have you here to close out our 2020 season. Patrick is the interim director of the Governor's Forest Management Task Force. Any further introduction would lead me to saying things I hope he will say today about action that may come. So I will simply leave it with that. And Steve is the president of the Sierra Business Council. Together, you both, I know one another, know this community, know this region, know this space, and represent knowledge of industry, policy, workforce development, education, community challenge. I mean, the breadth of perspectives that I know you both seek to coalesce in your work toward clear opportunity and action is mind-numbing. So thank you for being here. And today's panel format is largely going to be a discussion. So we'll start with a couple of questions. will allow you to speak with one another. We will hopefully have a dynamic, engaged question and answer. Robert and I will be monitoring the chat, so please feel free to throw questions in there, to raise your hand, to send a note to one of us. Engagement is a priority, so make your comments heard. And I want to start with a softball question, which is, there are so many stakeholders and so many seemingly competing priorities at play. Is alignment important, and how do we get there? I know you are both thinking about that question. That's not a softball question. I know you're thinking about that question, both of you. Patrick, would you start us off with a perspective on how we seek and whether we need to and how we get to alignment across all of these competing priorities?
Sure. I mean, I think and that's obviously a big part of my job right now, is trying to sort of connect the dots and deal with a lot of different agencies and programs that are in silos. And I think what's essential to try to get a handle on that is, and I'll try to do this really fast, is to try to kind of give you guys a sort of a layman's term version of the biggest trends that are happening right now in forest management, to then help us try to figure out that, okay, given those trends, how do we align to meet those trends? And I want to emphasize that seeing that Scott Conway is on with us, he's gonna wince at all my overgeneralizations and could probably answer all these questions in a lot more detail, because he's been on the cutting edge of virtually every one of these trends that I'm going to sort of quickly go through and pioneered them. But I started up in Tahoe about 15 years ago, and forest management was completely new to me. And what I've seen since that time is that we have the whole forest management space has just rapidly transitioned from a world where you had single agency, single purpose projects, on their own land, to these sort of large scale collaborative multi-benefit projects. And in fact, I would say there's, quick and dirty, there's sort of 7 large scale themes. One is everybody's going big. They know to get a handle on the forest management crisis, we've got to do projects that are tens of thousands of acres, not tens of acres. We've got to do multi-benefit projects, not just focus on, say, fire or timber. We need a lot more prescribed fire. Everybody wants to try to get there. We're using a lot more science, a lot more cutting-edge tools. That's a 4th tool. 5th, we're really trying to focus on wood utilization, not just for timber harvest, but to store carbon, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, do all sorts of things. 6th, we're all trying to be more collaborative. We're recognizing to get anything done, you've got to have a half a dozen different agencies and stakeholders on board. And then finally, everybody's trying to focus on development of regional collaborative frameworks as sort of the new framework for forest management. When I started, again, the Angora fire hit in Tahoe. So Tahoe is a great example of that. So you have one of the worst fires in history, a couple hundred, structures affected, and Tahoe did the old school thing. We mapped the whole basin, we figured out what the high priority, high risk neighborhoods are, and we attacked them one by one. 10-acre project here, 100-acre project there. State Parks took care of its land, Forest Service did its, we did ours. And then slowly over time, partly as a result of some of the pioneering work of Scott and others with the SAGEN process, we decided we needed to go bigger. And so we launched what's known as the Lake Tahoe West Restoration Project, which is a 60,000 acre project where we're trying to combine the efforts of state parks, the Forest Service, the Conservancy, Homewood Ski Area, use science, go multi-benefit. The old school was, if you ran into a stream zone or you ran into sensitive species, you walled them off. And the new way of thinking is you can't wall them off because they're just going to burn. And so that means you need a whole new set of tools to try to figure out how do you optimize biodiversity, timber harvest, carbon storage, water quality, sort of a whole new way of thinking. So all these sort of new trends are taking place, and the Lake Tahoe Basin, the Truckee area, the efforts that I've been involved in, Scott's been involved in, are really at the cutting edge in the West in trying to do this. The real challenge is, okay, it's easy to say you need to go big and you need to go collaborative, but as I've joked in the Lake Tahoe West arena, the hard part is not getting the stakeholders on the same page, it's getting the agencies on the same page. Because Parks has a culture and a way of doing things that's different than the Forest Service, that's different than the Conservancy, that's different than the RCD, that's different than the fire districts, and getting all those people on board and to do projects across ownerships is a big, big challenge. And then just operationally, how do you do things like surveys over tens of thousands of acres? How do you mark trees over tens of thousands of acres? Everybody wants to go there now, but we're just beginning to develop some of the tools that will help answer your question. Increasingly, the answer is regional frameworks, whether it's Lake Tahoe West, whether it's the SHN project that Scott was part of, whether it's some of the new projects. Over and over again, you're seeing less top-down work by the Forest Service, CAL FIRE, and more collaborative, interagency, stakeholder-driven regional frameworks throughout the state of California, where each region is trying to figure out what are its high risk, what are its priorities, hopefully getting a combination of state, federal, and local funding to take it to the next level. And so where the role of the state and federal agencies come in is helping those regional areas with frameworks so they don't have to start from scratch and try to figure out what are we trying to protect here, what are the risks, also providing them with decision support tools that help them assess trade-offs between prescribed fire and smoke and between various management strategies. So I know that's a long-winded answer, but where we're headed is towards large landscape regional collaboratives as our mechanism for alignment, where all these different trends that I've talked to can come together so that each region can get to a higher level based on its own sense of fire risk and sense of priorities. That's the bumper sticker version of a lot of stuff that's happening.
Wow. Yes, and hardly a bumper sticker, but yet for those on this call, and I see so many faces and names that are deep in certain verticals of this work, that really was a very succinct perspective as to all of the competing things that are coming into alignment. Steve, as someone who specifically looks at one region in much of your work, how might you react to what Patrick just said? Do you agree? And what are the other ways that you think about alignment? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that. We're never supposed to do that anymore. We're supposed to be smart enough to turn our microphones on. I think Patrick is spot on what the trends are, but he also kind of highlighted and foreshadowed what some of the challenges in that are. But before I go to that, I want to say I am actually optimistic that we can and will solve this problem. I think that's a really important thing, to set your mind frame in a position where you're looking at that 4,200,000 acres and you're looking at 31 fatalities and you're looking at 10,000 structures and you're recognizing the point that our region and across the entire state of California forests are fundamentally changing. But we can and will solve this problem, and we can and will get that alignment for a variety of reasons, but the biggest one is that we have to. Right? The crisis drives people together to solve problems, and I think what Patrick is describing in those seven kind of areas is essentially where we have been driven because we've had to be driven there in order to actually address the scale of the issue, right? But there were also some really difficult challenges that he highlighted in that. Number one, there's not a lot of capacity to do this work on the large landscape level. So if we want to go big, we need to be investing in capacity to go big, to bring people together and come to these solutions. If we want multiple benefits, we need to invest in the tools to measure those multiple benefits. And we have at least 3 places right now where we don't have tools that are good enough to do it. Some of the work that Scott is doing addresses that, but we can't really measure the trade-off benefit of one of those multi-benefits against the other. We don't have a good tool for evaluating ecosystem services and understanding what the value of the protection is that we're providing. And we do not have good tools to identify avoided costs and to actually value avoided costs in the marketplace, right? So, so that's a challenge, I think. I think another challenge is that, you know, I think Patrick is spot on that you can get everyone around the table today and you can get them to agree that the real challenge is getting the agencies to actually change their mandates first legislatively and then culture in order to go along with the change that needs to be implemented, right? And that cultural change piece takes a long time and is a huge commitment and is something that we all need to be working on every single day. That what Patrick described is essentially a systems thinking way of looking at managing and adapting our forests. And we have to bring all of the different agencies and entities together to see it in that same light so they understand that their piece or their vertical, as you put it, Teal, is really significant in solving the overall problem. And they can see clearly where it fits in and how it is supported by other, other efforts and how they contribute to the success of other efforts. And then finally, I would say, you know, I think one of the other challenges is this issue that when we get to getting agencies to actually coordinate their activities, we really need the strategic framework for doing that so that they can see how that benefit actually kind of fulfills the mandates that they've been given by law and by legislation and other things. So I think the work that Patrick is doing to try to align agency objectives is so important in getting us to this place where we can actually all be aligned on what the big solution is, from local vegetation management to town or countywide policies for zoning ordinances and kind of fire safe and hazard planning to all the way up to the large landscape planning. That each one of those pieces needs to be working together in its transect, and that takes a strategic framework and getting everyone on board with the same kind of strategic framework, and then recognizing that's going to change as conditions change, so that needs to be adaptively managed over time as well. So, but I do think it's achievable, and I've seen more progress in the mindset around forest management in California in the last 5 years than I saw in the last 20 years, quite frankly.
Patrick, your work in leading the Governor's Forest Management Task Force, so much of what Steve is describing about strategic frameworks that coalesce efforts, you mentioned regional scale, regions understanding their own risk and their own opportunity. I'm interested simply to hear your reactions to what Steve just described as those 3 to 4 critical things that have to be addressed to get to your optimism, and I appreciate your optimism, Steve. But I'm also curious to ask you, Patrick, about examples where you might see strategic frameworks that are either in the pipeline or have worked or you see as critical to moving forward.
Well, yeah, no, there are several great examples. I mean, I think the pioneering work was actually done just north of Truckee, and Scott was one of the leaders in that at Sagen, where they for the first time really sort of pioneered more ecological approaches and holistic approaches to forest management. And now other collaboratives throughout the state are taking that up and even going a step further. As I mentioned before, we've got a Lake Tahoe West initiative at Tahoe that's trying to do that. We've got an even bigger initiative that I helped launch several years ago called the Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative, that's looking at the entire area, largely between Placerville and Auburn and Tahoe, between 50 and 80, and seeing, can we do an assessment of that entire 2.4 million acres and come up collectively with a restoration strategy and a wood products utilization strategy that deals with that entire landscape. There's a great model up in the North Coast called the North Coast Partnership, where they've got local government, tribes, Forest Service, working from, literally from Marin County to Modoc County, working together, jointly prioritizing projects. So there are lots of great models. The challenge is, like so much in our world, it's very uneven. Candidly, the Tahoe area and Truckee area has got more money than a lot of other areas. So you've got great pilots in some areas, and then you've got other areas that are just really, really struggling. And so one of the things we're talking about at the Sacramento level is how to provide, and this is the number one issue I hear on forest management throughout the state is, as Steve said, is capacity building. We've got to switch from, at the state level and the federal level, from providing competitive grants for individual projects, which ends up rewarding the areas that already have their act together and leaves other folks further behind and doesn't allow people to plan. You're not going to hire the crews, the contractors, the support workers if you get a couple $1 million 1 year through a grant and then nothing for several years. What we're hearing from everybody statewide is we need sustained funding at the regional level so that we can hire full-time, long-term crews, contractors, support people to develop a sustained program. And so when you see the governor's budget announcement in January, that will be a big part of the flavor. That new wave has finally sunk in. And I think it's going to end up being the chief organizing principle, the regional frameworks, and the chief funding vehicle. The challenge is, candidly, the money is going to be arriving ahead of the frameworks. We really, and so
I think you're hitting a really important point, Patrick, which is that, like, what we've not come to grips yet in the state of California is that the scale of the problem is so huge that the solutions that we need are going to require sustained, long-term, regular funding, and that the way we have traditionally funded forest management in the state through periodic bond measures or uneven budget allocations is not going to work anymore. That in essence, when we start getting to the scale of 4 million acres a year, and to be honest, that could be small compared to what we see 20 years from now, right? That, we need, we need funding at the level of like $3 billion a year in our estimation, and that could even be low to address this problem. And there's going to need, so part of it is, I think what you guys are putting forward are a whole suite of solutions that can help bring the public along to understand that they need to be investing at that level in order to really address this issue statewide. And we know what's at risk from a landscape loss, a structure loss, and a lives lost kind of perspective. But there's also something else at risk here, which is that if California forests essentially become carbon emitting rather than carbon sinking entities, then all of the work that we do around our statewide climate goals that are laid out in AB 32 and in the scoping plan and all these mechanisms for reducing greenhouse gas emissions is lost. So this is really an investment in meeting our long-term statewide objective, and it's going to have to be sustained, So do you want $3 billion a year, Patrick?
Well, I mean, I think, he's right. I mean, I think that's going to be the challenge. I think, you know, everybody, well, I say everybody, there's broad-based agreement in Sacramento that funding forest health work through bonds every several years is not the way to go, but candidly, there's not agreement on an alternative. And so you're likely to have, and there already was one refloated, I think, 2 days ago, as Steve knows, you know, yet another bond that's headed for the 2022 ballot. And that's going to be several $billions, not just for forest health, but for a wide range of, you know, climate-related activities. But it's just too easy for members of the legislature and administration to go the bond route because it avoids tough choices and it has the appearance of free money. And so it's just too appealing to go that route. And so fortunately, with the arrival of the cap and trade program, the forestry sector has $200 million annually. It's not enough, but at least it has that stable funding source now year after year to build on. But Steve's right. Ultimately, the forest sector is going to need dedicated funding like the transportation sector, the air quality sector, but there isn't those other sectors have fee mechanisms that get them there, whether it's a gas tax or it's a permit fee. The problem with the forest health world is there isn't an obvious way to go. And so as Steve knows, over the years, many different interest groups have floated lots of different creative fee mechanisms, you know, whether it's an oil and gas fee, a license plate fee, now they're talking about a plastics fee, all sorts of creative ideas, but an extreme reluctance to use general fund money to get us to go where we want to go. Although there was a little bit of a breakthrough last year, at least psychologically, where the legislature had pitched, I think, a $3 billion proposal, and finance basically just said, you know, it'd be cheaper just to give you guys the general fund money up front because the interest payments would be so high. But those flashes of recognition are few and far between.
Yeah, I think Patrick is highlighting another really important point. That in essence, we know where we need to go, but we don't have consensus on how to get there to fund this work yet.
Yeah.
So over the next couple years, there's going to be this dance where we're doing budget allocations. I'm happy to hear, Patrick, that we're going to have a much more robust budget in the January proposal. That'll be great. We're going to need to do budget allocations, and we're probably going to need to do at least one more bond measure in order to fund some of the work that needs to be done up front. But eventually, we have to answer this permanent funding source question.
Right.
And if we don't answer it, we're not going to be able to do the work at the scale that we need to. So
I'm going to ask a question digging deeper on that. And this actually reflects a question that came up in the chat as well. Stacey, you mentioned co-benefits. And Patrick, you mentioned creative fees, oil and gas fees, taxes. What other, if any, mechanisms are in the pipeline to place a price, either on the value of forest restoration or on the carbon abatement with the cap and trade markets, as you mentioned, or through other avenues? What ecosystem benefits or ecosystem pricing might we consider or is in consideration that could help us look at long-term funding?
Go ahead, Steve.
Well, I don't know if Zach Knight's on the call, but I think Blue Forest Conservation and their benefit bond concept is a great example of that, where in essence, the Yuba County Water Agency downstream is paying for upstream forest management in order to secure the supply of higher quality water based on that forest management treatment, and probably higher yield water from the same watershed as well. You know, another mechanism might be converting biomass to renewable fuels and tying it to the renewable fuel standard and the pricing attached there. Although, you know, Patrick mentioned the California climate initiatives as well, and the Greenhouse Gas Emission Reduction Fund. but the cap and trade program technically runs out in 2030. So this larger question of how do we pay for greenhouse gas emission reductions or carbon sequestering activities, and how do we attach a fee structure to that across the state, I think is going to need to be re-looked at between now and 2030. So that's another way. And then Stacy mentioned the concept of creating market mechanisms that pay for some of these other co-benefits from forest management, like improved air quality, species and habitat population viability, and attaching a essentially fee structure to each one of those, which is yet another kind of approach that you could take. Each of these is going to be highly controversial, and is going to be a huge political effort to go through.
Yeah, I would say there's two, I would say, different trends on that topic. One trend historically is that, because the focus is on timber harvest, and timber harvest generates revenue, no need for public funding. So until the cap and trade program came along, there was very little public funding going into forest health in California. As the world begins to recognize that we're not just talking about timber harvest projects, we're talking about projects that have multiple benefits: water quality, air quality, carbon storage. The argument for significant public funding has accelerated. And that's why you're seeing, the bonds that were adopted, back when I did some of the water bonds in the, 80s, 90s, none of them included major amounts for forest health. They included billions for water. Ironically, even though you have water districts with their own ratepayers, they still weren't shy about getting billions of dollars in state and federal money for water supply. But the forest health group was never at the table, because the assumption was you would recover a good part of your costs through timber harvest. So there's been a huge upsurge in interest in making sure that these bonds and cap and trade have, that the public funding sources do include forest health. And that's really just for the first time in the last several years. The second trend, as Steve said, is to try to see if we can figure out ways to better quantify and monetize benefits. But that effort is still sort of in its infancy, and is a tough sell to a lot of folks, and for a lot of reasons, because it's complicated to arrive at those numbers and to sell, investors and others on those numbers. And so it'll probably take a while before markets. It's also, I would say, one of the biggest challenges there is that the biggest benefit is as Steve said earlier, is the avoided cost of megafires and of dealing with the future climate impacts. And that's very difficult to quantify, much less use as a basis for a fee system, or investment system.
But there is, of course, the third mechanism, which is private investment, right? That these forests are generating. If you look at all of the biomass in California from forests, agricultural uses, diverted municipal solid waste, clean municipal solid waste, etc., you're probably talking about something in the area of 60 million tons a year. And there are at least 3 or 4 products that many of the people working, on the phone today are working on: bioenergy, heat, small diameter timber, and biofuels that have markets today. And I think a really interesting question for state policy is that if we don't want to make enough of a investment in public dollars in order to use that material, then how do we use the public dollars as a market forcing mechanism to create the markets for biomass or bioenergy, biofuels, small diameter timber, and heat, in order to convert our market to value those things, right? And we have had traditionally, I think, a bias towards market neutrality in our policy. That, we open it up to the free market and they're going to find a solution. Well, this is a classic example of a place where the free market has not found a solution, you know? And if we really, you know, we know where the products are that are actually viable, we should be focusing, in my humble opinion, a big chunk of state investment on priming the pump for those markets and making them viable. We should force the market. That's what we're doing with electric vehicles. That's what we're doing with renewable energy. We should be doing it with forest products as well.
Patrick, interested to hear your reaction on that. As you both know, I have worked quite a bit on thinking through what financing mechanisms could enable public dollars to encourage equity investment or create credit enhancements to force a market rather than just create the tools that, from a financing perspective, or, hearkening back to the previous question, payment for ecosystem services. Those two would ostensibly effectively deal with the externalities of the market and drive market solutions. What's your response to the other avenue, which is pick a market and force it?
Well, yeah, I mean, no, I think that's right. I think that the challenge is a couple challenges. One is this is not something that government does well. And so it's one of the reasons why, say, the federal agencies have really struggled over the past, 5 years, a decade, to try to figure out how do the state federal agencies jumpstart the market. It's been really, really challenging to try to deal with that. This really hit home several years ago when we had the Tree Mortality Task Force, which was the predecessor to Forest Management Task Force, where you had and still have over 100 million, dead and dying trees. Surely a market would spring up. All that high value material is just sitting there for the taker, but it didn't, because it's expensive. To deal with all that stuff. And you've got to have the infrastructure, and you've got to have the financing, and you've got to have long-term contracts to make sure if you're going to spend millions and millions of dollars in developing a facility that you're going to have material for 20 years, not 2 years. And so huge barriers on both the supply side to try to get the agencies to be thinking more about, long-term supply on the one hand, and then trying to figure out, are there long-term markets on the other end? So an enormous amount of work has been done on this topic, but candidly, still waiting for breakthroughs. I think what you're seeing in the task force recommendations on that topic are pilots, basically, on both ends. So you're going to see a Forest Management Task Force recommendation that says, and the Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative is going to be one of the pilots to say, can we move towards long-term supply agreements? So if a facility is trying to get up and running, like the one at Loyalton, it can count on 20 or 30 years of supply. Can we start a pilot project to try to do that? And then on the other end of the system, can we provide low-cost financing through a state catalyst fund so that folks like the Loyalton facility can get really, really cheap financing to try to make it on that end. And then you've also got to have the energy and other suppliers, ready to guarantee that they'll take that, that supplier material also. So a lot of pilots are happening around all of these barriers. But I'd be the first to say that we're a ways from having a comprehensive strategy.
So this is where we get to be a little bit conversations with the arch druid, Patrick, because I just want to point out that we have forced markets in the past, and we're doing it right now. Rural electrification was forcing a market for electricity. CAFE standards forced a market for reduced emissions from automobiles.
Yeah.
CFCs forced a market for reducing fluorocarbons and eliminating the ozone hole. And we're doing it right now by saying we're going to go all electric vehicle by 2035, right? So, I think I appreciate the point that there are problems to deal with when one forces a market. but I think the scale of the problem is so large that we at least have to think through what would it take to force markets for certain products, like switching out, liquid fuels with biofuels, carbon-based liquid or petroleum-based liquid fuels with biofuels. What would it take to require 10% of all building materials or 20% or whatever it is in state-constructed buildings are made from wood products? What would it take to require every building above 20,000 square feet to do a carbon calculation for their building materials, right? There are ways that we could intervene that would create markets that would not be too disruptive, but would begin to use more of this material on an ongoing basis.
Right. No, I think I don't disagree. As Steve well knows, for instance, the California Public Utilities Commission tomorrow could create that market, but they have a more narrow focus. Their focus is what is the cheapest way to supply energy to the grid, not what is the way that has the broadest public benefits. Because there's no question that adding more biomass to the grid than the PUC is comfortable with would have enormous public health and economic benefits. But because it's more expensive than solar, not only does the PUC not want to go there, but the public interest groups, advocacy groups in front of PUC don't want to go there because there's such a focus on reducing costs. So it's partly back, I know we keep coming back to this, but it's partly is this issue of quantifying avoided cost of doing that. And I think there was a report, I don't know, Steve, if you saw it just 2 days ago that crossed my desk where sort of the first study that I've seen that really tries to take a comprehensive look at that. And I just think we need to really keep hammering on the cost of not effectively, treating our forest, because
here's a great example of avoided costs not being calculated. The CPUC report on the brownouts in California in July and August came out and essentially identified that one of the largest causes of those brownouts was that we now have so much renewable energy on the grid, essentially, that when it fails to produce later in the afternoon and early in the evening, because we have so much intermittent renewable, right, we end up having a shortage of power at certain times of the day, and what we need is more baseload renewable that can produce energy between 4 o'clock in the afternoon and 7 o'clock in the evening, right? So that whole thing of that in essence, solar and wind is lower cost. It's only lower cost if you don't take into account the intermittency of the power and the cost of a blackout, right? That's an avoided cost that we do not calculate in California, right? And if you calculated that avoided cost, you might discover that biopower at $120 a megawatt hour is actually equally as competitive. So.
Yeah.
And Steve, speaking of what you've both been touching on, which is how do we monetize some of these challenges? And, fundamentally, there are these incredible externalities which don't carry value. Markets are basically efficient, but we have to fix the externalities that are sort of policy problems to help enable that. Benji, you asked a question which gets one step further into that around carbon financing. And I would love to just pitch it to you to ask that question.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the really insightful conversation. I was curious to know a little bit more about the carbon financing and what have been some of the pros and the cons of that so far. And in other words, what have been some of the benefits? You mentioned $200 million in, I think, annual funding. And what have been some of the limitations and therefore some of the areas to try and improve on, some of the opportunities that could potentially get sorted out, perhaps by some of the folks here in this group. so that carbon can become a little bit more of an opportunity to value or monetize some of the forest management and forest restoration work that needs to be done.
Patrick, you want to start on that?
Yeah, I mean, Steve's probably more knowledgeable than I am, but I guess a couple quick points. One is, the so-called cap and trade money is basically just fee revenue that are being used for not just forest health projects, but transportation projects, et cetera. I think the trend there, as I said before, is to try to invest more and more of that money strategically, through regional frameworks and other ideas rather than through competitive grants. There's also completely separately the sort of carbon offset market that ARB runs that candidly I'm not familiar with and is in a completely different universe of interest groups and players that don't talk to each other. And so I'm actually very interested in Steve and others' sort of view on there's just no intersection between the two at all, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, there really isn't. But okay, so two answers. Number one, Benji, the CCI, the greenhouse gas emission fund funding is critical to California forest management. And it is one of the only consistent long-term sources of funding, even though it runs out in 2030, that we currently have. It's something that we should be building on, right? But on the other side of the coin, as Patrick was mentioning, actually developing the projects to qualify for the cap and trade market and to sell forest carbon credits is actually a pretty heavy lift for landowners, as, by the way, Hardy Bullock on the phone knows, okay? There's a very high project development cost. So for private landowners, you might need to invest $250,000 in doing the carbon inventories, preparing the project, doing the modeling, putting in place the forest management plan, everything else you need to do in order to get to the point where you can apply to register on the carbon market to sell those credits. And even though the credits are generally selling, they might not sell at a rate where you get your return on investment for that initial investment for a decade or more. And in essence, you're encumbering that land for 100 years, and it might take you a good portion of that 100 years to see the payback. So unless you have landowners that have, number one, that much upfront capital, and number two, that much patience, it's really hard to develop projects to place on the carbon market. We've tried to do 4, and none of them ever made it to the market. Now, we were kind of crazy in some of them. We did some oak woodland projects, which would be really nice if those would work, But it's a difficult process. And Stacy, to answer your question about what percentage of the budget is forest management, right now, most of that is coming from CCI, from the California Climate Initiative, or the cap and trade monies, right? And Patrick, it's been running, what, $200 to $300 million a year generally?
Yeah.
So the cost of wildfire fighting this last year was $1 billion at the state level alone, not including federal, right? And the state budget was what, $160 billion this year, Patrick? Somewhere around there.
Yeah.
So we're talking about 0.5% of the budget, and we can't really think realistically about going from that to $3 billion a year. We've got to solve that problem, really.
Yeah. Although I can't resist an anecdote here too, because, okay, so you've got this cap and trade money, and so state money is going out to projects all over the state, and of course many of them are going to projects on federal land, because Forest Service owns 60% of the land in California. And so as a requirement for getting this cap and trade money, of course, you've got to measure the carbon storage or emission reduction benefits of those projects. Okay, so that's the key parameter that CAL FIRE wants to see. Yes, it would like to see multiple benefit projects, but they're not requiring quantified water quality benefits, air quality benefits, biodiversity. They are requiring quantified carbon benefits. So I often tell this to my friends in Washington, that under the last administration, the only parameter that the Forest Service is measuring specifically is carbon. People are astonished because what it tells you also, which is another trend that I didn't talk about earlier, is how state money can, by dangling large amounts of state money, how that can influence federal policy. I can assure you, Scott, I'd love your input on this. The Forest Service would not be measuring the specific carbon benefits of all of its projects if the state weren't requiring it. And so it's been a great carrot to try to get everybody thinking about emission reduction potential carbon storage benefits. Nothing like requiring it as part of a grant to motivate all the modeling, all the work to try to really figure out how forest projects are helping deal with climate change and carbon storage.
Scott, you want to jump in on that and share some perspective?
Sure. Yeah, no, this is a great conversation.
Scott, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you sound quite far away to me, and if it's the case for others, I'm just going to ask you to speak up a little bit.
Okay, I will speak up. Let me see. Shut off my heater. Is that better? Anyways, great conversation. Several things. One is everybody's absolutely spot on. I just wanted to highlight that one issue that we had found early on is that the challenge of being able to quantify a sustainable supply in the forest. And I say sustainable supply, not just supply, because those two things together are very important. One, of course, is the supply, where we don't have the data, and folks that know me, this is my mantra, we don't have the tree level data in order to effectively quantify a supply. And if we can't quantify that supply, even at its base level, how are we going to get investors to put their money into something that we can't effectively count? The other piece that we understand that's critical is to determine that sustainability of that supply, because nobody wants to invest in a tree if they can't know that that tree was harvested sustainably. And so that requires a systematic project level type approach that spans all the silos that all that stuff is occurring in. Because nobody's just going to invest in one private landowner or maybe one land agency. They want to see a comprehensive, de-siloed production of what is probably going to come out and how much of that is going to come out. So I just like to highlight that just talking on the demand side of the solution is absolutely imperative, but trying to get at that quantitative supply side is just equally as important. And that goes into the carbon calculation. And this is a challenge everywhere in the forestry sector in California, is nobody counts carbon the same way, partially because nobody has the same data to count carbon the same way. And so we're always struggling with, okay, you count carbon with a survey, we count carbon with LiDAR, you count carbon through your thumb and measuring a few trees. There's no way to actually quantify it, and it's working how AB 32 set up, but again, it's not going to attract an investor. So anyways, this is something, I would love it if we were only having to deal with the demand side of things, but frankly, until we're able to completely solve the supply side, we're not going to get there. And I'll just say that with all that said, I think the North Yuba Forest project that we're working on with Forest Service and YWA and Blue Forest is going to be a great example of how we're going to get at that quantification, which helps us then calculate avoided losses quite much better. And then even more important is go beyond avoided losses and start talking about those benefits, right? Because avoided losses of, we just saved a house, we just saved a watershed. But by doing something, we also increased water. We also improved wildlife habitat, and all those benefits are more than avoided loss. And then all of a sudden, the investment becomes even more attractive. But it all starts with counting at that very specific level that allows an investor to be comfortable with how we're talking about supply.
Thank you, Scott. Patrick or Stephen, more comments on that? If not, more comments on that. Let me create space for that.
Can I also ask a follow-up question as you maybe respond to what Scott said, which is around whether or not some of the public land, particularly the national forests, could tap into the carbon offset side of the equation. It sounds like they are tapping into the grant application side, which is the 200 million in funding. But is there an opportunity, and I don't know if this is getting into double counting, but for those that aren't applying to that 200 million grant funding, could they potentially, with like a straightforward reforestation type project, tap into the carbon offset revenue?
Yeah, I don't think we've solved that problem yet. Patrick or Scott, maybe you guys know, but the last time we looked at that, because selling carbon offsets requires encumbering the property with some kind of restrictions, the Forest Service was not open to doing carbon offset projects on federal land, right? So to the best of my knowledge, we haven't gotten past that roadblock yet. And then you do get into those issues of how much of that is double counting. Should that land be managed for carbon benefit anyway? And should it be paid separately? Or is that a federal responsibility? And there's all kinds of other kind of problems that people have run into trying to do that. And I know that people have taken runs at pilot projects to try to demonstrate how you could do direct carbon offset projects on federal land and have not been successful so far. So, Patrick or Scott?
No, I think that's right. It's very challenging. I think on the private side, maybe this is an oversimplification, but you know, you've got a set of forest practice rules that limit what you can and can't do. And so if you do better than the forest practice rules, you can get a credit for that folks will pay for. On public land, it's a lot trickier because there's a whole camp that argues you should be doing that anyway if you're the Forest Service or state parks. And so, and then of course, if you get past that problem, then you got to reach agreement on how to quantify it. And as Steve said, you know, are the agencies willing to lock that in? Even on private land, you know, it's tricky because, you know, you bought that offset, but then what happens if you get a fire and your whole forest is just burned down? How do you got to do a complex calculation to try to deal with that issue? Are you committed to reforestation? Are you committed? It has been an issue with the cap and trade grants where some grantees have refused to take the grants from CAL FIRE because they don't want to commit 20, 30 years out. It's not like most grant programs where you get money and you agree to do something for the next 5 years, 10 years. You know, to get the real carbon storage benefits, you got to do it for decades. And to try to get people to sign up for that, boy, that's really hard, whether it's a public agency or a private landowner.
I guess I just want to jump in on that point. We're seeing this not just in the forest work and ocean stewardship, kind of across the climate space. You know, there's more and more carbon measurement. A lot of things coming up, which is great, right? There's the private market ventures are popping up, but it also leads to investor fatigue just in that general term. You can go to an investor with that term and they'd be like, let's just let this play out. So I'm wondering, I think it's critical to the future success, but are there other things that we need to look at and not bank on just carbon like we discussed? But even, you know, what are the more like private investable opportunities that we see out there?
Yeah, so there were two things mentioned earlier tangentially that I think were really interesting that we've made a run at policy-wise in the past and basically hit brick walls, but are really interesting ideas. One of them is within the compliance market for carbon credits in California, if we set a percentage of those compliance credits that need to be purchased from in-state projects, that would actually make a really big difference. Now, when CARB was doing the initial cap and trade program, and we had a staff member who sat on one of the committees designing the program, we recommended that, and they feared an interstate commerce clause challenge. But I'm not, but however, when their solicitor looked at it, they were like, well, we might get challenged, we might not, we don't know, right? So depending upon the administration, that is something that we might want to look at again, because if those credits were all being purchased within the state, it would drive a huge market for carbon credits on forested landscapes in California. The second thing that someone mentioned in the comments that I think is really interesting that we've pushed for in the past is requiring a carbon calculation for new building construction and incentivizing the use of wood products in favor of steel and concrete because of the carbon benefit from using those wood products. So you wouldn't even necessarily need to tax steel and concrete if you simply required the carbon calculation and made building developers who actually sequestered carbon in their buildings, created incentives for them. We think it would make a huge difference in how much of that material got used in the state, and that could be paid for through some kind of trading mechanism. So, but this is a really tough problem. We're getting into all of these really very heavy political lifts to get to doing what, in my humble opinion, if we don't figure out the solution soon, the taxpayers are just going to do it anyway because they're going to have to, you know.
Can I just ask about that really quick, Steve? So it is a lot of political lift. How do communities like ours kind of start to understand? I mean, to me, I listen to these conversations and I feel like I'm still learning so much of, you know, the complexities behind this. And to be able to talk to our elected officials at the state, at the federal level about what it is we need, you know, who are your go-to sources for advocacy? Both of you, actually. I'd love to understand how just a normal person in our community can really engage and feel like they're helping with at least their vote and their voices.
Patrick, do you want to start with
No,
that?
I was going to say, Steve, you run an advocacy shop, so you should point them the right way.
Yeah, so first, we have to remember that California is probably one of the most complex political environments to work in, other than maybe the federal government. Although yesterday I was on the phone with someone who spent the last 20 years working on federal environmental policy with the EPA, who said, I thought I saw a difficult system to shift and navigate in Congress. California is a nightmare, right? So we have to remember that what we're dealing with here is an extremely complex political system that has tons of stakeholders, tons of competing objectives, and all of those kind of issues, right? But, you know, the answer to your question is our legislators, our agency staff, and leadership does not hear enough yet from the public in California that we actually need to change the forest problem. We've seen a plethora of articles in the media for the last year about something like prescribed fire, right? Which I think is a huge part of the solution, Patrick, right? Is getting to the point where we can use prescribed fire and use fire as a tool to manage our forested landscapes. Yet when I talk to prescribed fire practitioners, they have these roadblocks that are, you know, local air quality regulations and constraints, time of year constraints, weather constraints, capacity constraints for how many people can actually do applied fire, all of the rest of these issues. So getting that, like, this goes back to that alignment issue. Getting the stated desire of the public to line up with the policy that is being advanced and breaking down those barriers that exist today is going to be critical. And, you know, so it's through organizations. I'm advocating. So we run, an advocacy shop at SBC. We do advocate in Sacramento and do a lot of it around forest and biomass. We participate in statewide coalitions that advocate. We're beginning to work on media around these issues, but there's got to be more of a voice from the public saying we want to solve this problem. And that voice has got to include a wider range of stakeholders, right? Like right now, most of those stakeholders are environmentalists. And what we're beginning to see now is local government advocates who fear the impact of wildfire because it has been so impactful. But this is a business issue. This is an energy issue. This is so building that stakeholder base is going to be really, really important. And I think you're beginning to see it shift. It's an air quality issue. It's a public health issue. It's a disadvantaged community issue. Think of farm workers working with horrible air quality last year after the CNU and the other fires in the Bay Area, right? There is not enough of a groundswell of support from the public yet, and they should be working through every one of their organizations and kind of networks to advance the public policy objectives.
Yeah, just two quick thoughts on that. One is to echo what Steve said. Having worked in my previous career on water, I spent 2 decades trying to work with Steve and others, trying to get folks in the Bay Area and in LA to understand that their water just doesn't come out of the faucet. It actually comes from the Sierra and the upper watersheds, to make that connection to help pay for it without any success. And so what's happening now, and I was just literally on the phone yesterday with a staffer in the assembly who said, my urban members care about this. Why? Because of smoke. It's ironic that it's the public health impacts of fires in urban areas that may politically tip the balance, where for the first time you're going to have the Bay Area and particularly the LA delegation, which candidly is where the power base is in the legislature right now, finally really starting to pay attention to forest health and fire because of the smoke issue. The second comment I have is, while it's true that there are all the traditional sources of, lobbying, and Steve Group does a great job at that, whether it's the bonds, whether it's legislation, never forget the power of local areas and regions getting their act together, because Absolutely. That's where money flows. It's not a coincidence. Tahoe isn't getting money just because of Harry Reid traditionally and Feinstein. It's because it's got the best plan in the West. The North Coast Partnership in the North Coast, has barely any representation in the legislature. It's got one member of the Senate and the Assembly. They get tons of money because they have their act together. They've got the fire districts, they've got the RCD, they've got the county, they got the city, they got the tribes. If you can pull together that coalition regionally, I guarantee you money will flow. So that to me is sort of and then at the local level, that's where you deal with all these trade-offs and these issues, that people have talked about. If you can get a regional collaborative plan together, that's the best ticket for funding. And it is happening. I think this area, ironically, is one of those areas between, the work that's being done, in this region is some of the most collaborative and most innovative. And so I think being able to support those efforts in addition to, supporting reform in Sacramento and Washington is really critical. So a session like this where people beyond the usual watershed groups in Truckee, Tahoe, and forest people, but getting the business community knowledgeable, giving local elected officials knowledgeable and supportive of these regional frameworks is really important.
Yeah, I would be remiss as an advocate if I didn't make 2 points. Number one, there is a proposal out there right now that we worked with a bunch of partners on, like we weren't the originator of it. There's a huge collaboration of groups across the state proposing a $500 million emergency budget allocation in the 2020 budget, a $1.5 billion budget allocation in the 2021-2022 budget, and a $10 billion climate bond, at least 20% of which goes to forest management on the 2022 ballot. And anyone who wants to learn about that, feel free to contact us at Sierra Business Council. We can give you more information about it. But, we do need to get the funding in the places where it needs to go in order to move the ball forward, right? But I think another answer to this question is developing local strategies and local partnerships that can actually scale in their impact around solving some of these problems. So, as a resident of Truckee, I'm going to throw out something I've been thinking about quite a bit, that we have this whole process going on to develop a general plan update and a climate action plan in it. We have at least a theoretical commitment to achieving carbon neutrality in Truckee. And all of our strategies to date are focusing on essentially the built environment, fleet electrification, and wastewater. But the reality is we're a 33 square mile city that is 60% or more forested. And of that 40% of our land that is not forested, 20% of it used to be wetlands before we built the freeway and the high school and all the rest of this stuff in the wetlands in the region. If we could tie our carbon neutrality strategy to natural land management, in addition to the built environment, fleet electrification, and wastewater treatment, it would make a huge difference in demonstrating at the local level that you can actually be carbon negative, that you can actually plan for negativity rather than just avoiding emissions. You can actually take carbon out of the atmosphere and still have a vibrant living city, and that's a huge opportunity. And those are the types of projects that Patrick's talking about that money flows to. Have a bold vision and work to get all of the stakeholders at the table and link it to the regional action that's going on, and begin to count your own co-benefits and avoided costs and report that, and money will flow to those projects because people will realize that's part of the solution. We could do that right here. That's my soapbox.
Hey guys, this is Allison Wolf. I'm on my phone, so I can't raise my hand. I'm sorry to pipe in, but I know many of you, and I just want to offer to the conversation. Our team, so I'm Scott Conway's partner, and we've got several other co-founders and a new hybrid entity that's part nonprofit that's building a data trust for all the data that's germane to keeping communities safe and ecosystems, making ecosystems more resilient. And then a platform play that can build multiple applications for connected issues of land management, land use planning, evacuation planning, those kinds of things. And then Scott's advising services to actually help community collaboratives through these visual applications that we're building make good decisions that have really good science and data behind them. So we've got our team comes from, we've got the person that built the Lyft platform, that built much of the Facebook platform, the Box platform, and Guidewire, which is an insurance risk tool maker. So we've got an amazing team. And then one of the co-founders of Netflix is behind us, financially helped us seed fund the public benefit corporation side of the house. So I feel like a lot of this conversation and why we focus on what we're focused on is a data problem. And until we have the data infrastructure and the tool infrastructure to actually make data-driven decisions and stop making decisions based on historical data or intuition or experience, but actually be able to look into the future and build powerful scenarios using the compute and AI and stuff that we have today. So I just want to mention that I think some of this stuff about linking the micro level that Scott and Steve talked about to the regional and state level, and even kind of more regional, in the Western US, being able to link those things up strategically for policy change and prioritization and finding the biggest opportunities to unlock benefits of good management and land use planning and those kinds of things, it really does come down to a data problem that we're super excited to be solving, and we're happy to tell any of you more about that.
Thanks, Allison.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I was just going to open it up, and so that was perfect timing. So Patrick and Steve, if you have reactions to what Allison just shared, excellent. Please go ahead. And otherwise, questions. I know several have been posted in the chat, but there may be those of you with burning questions that would just like to jump in, and you're welcome to do so.
Hardy, I'm actually curious about the question you asked about how do we do this on the local level while we're responding to all of these disasters and emergencies? I think that's a really interesting kind of problem that we face in Sierra Nevada communities, you know? Could you elaborate on that a little? Oh, he may have left.
Well, I was following up on that. Hardy, are you there? Go ahead.
No, I'll just say on that, I think that is I've had conversations with the Forest Service in the last couple of days where, we're all trying to ramp up. As many of you have heard, the target is to try to get to 1 million acres treated by 2025. And what I'm hearing from them is, well, but we got to restore 4 million acres that just burned. And so it's a real challenge to try to sort of move ahead while you're trying to play catch up at the same time. And given the limited agency staff and resources, it is really, really hard to get ahead of the curve.
Well, that goes back, once again, I think to that avoided cost issue.
Yeah.
Like, unless we can really quantify avoided costs, we're not going to be able to convince the public or the agencies that we need to invest in avoiding those costs rather than responding to the, initial.
Yeah.
But
this is Jim Boyd. I'd like to make a comment rather than ask a question. Well, Patrick and I go way, way back, so we've worked together on this issue for years, as have I. The issue of avoided costs or co-benefits goes all the way back to about the year 2000. It was recognized by those of us in California state government working on something called the Biomass Interagency Working Group, founded to begin to address these kinds of issues, as a key problem that needed to be explored, and the co-benefits needed to be identified and then priced out so they could maybe be monetized. And that's never, ever been accomplished. And so both Steve and in particular you, Steve, have touched upon this as a problem that needs to continue to be pushed. In the narrow, and I also want to say that I've never seen a large, strong political constituency for the forest, for the health of the forest. And right now there is more interest because we're burning them down. People like Patrick and I might have thought that the Angora fire might be the fire that starts a fire under people, but we've seen fire after fire after fire, and only with the catastrophic fires of the last couple of years is there some interest. But as one who has sat and participated, I spent 20 years of my life at the Air Board, 10 years as Energy Commissioner, 4 or 5 years in the Resources Agency. I watched the competition for the cap and trade dollars, and those with strong political constituencies made what I consider to be outrageous requests for those kinds of dollars, i.e. outrageous in that the law says you have to prove that you make greenhouse gas reductions. Some of them were outrageous, but they had the political constituencies, got the politicians in Sacramento to make the allocations. The forest has not had a big enough political constituency. I'm delighted to hear about all the regional stuff, and it's got to be brought together. But co-benefits ought to be high on the list of things that people. One of the problems is you could identify them, you could even price them. You couldn't figure out how to monetize them. It would take time over time. And when you're in Sacramento spending dollars, particularly if you're spending general fund dollars, it's, what are you going to do for me today? Not what are you going to do for me years from now? That's what has been a pressure against biomass energy. It costs more. It will always cost more. And it was subsidized in the earliest years by, of all people, California electric ratepayers. That's why the PUC had difficulty with continuing to support that subject. Now, there's terrible biases against it in Sacramento. There are environmental biases. There is an unfounded bias on the part of the modern day PUC. Maybe not today, but under the last leader of the PUC. And there's a bias for electricity and no other kind of renewable. So you're going to have a political constituency, have people connect all the dots and where the benefits are and what have you. So in doing all these other things which will mass together, we've still got to figure out how to get people in political and policy power in Sacramento to really pay more and more attention to this subject and to begin to make their votes in favor of this constituency, this important constituency. We identify the water yield and water quality as an issue, but try to get people to pay for it. And it goes on. You can list them. You can figure out who benefits. The public as a whole benefits, but you're not going to get general fund dollars. So let us not forget to leave that on the plate as we do the menu of things that have to be done, please.
Yeah, Jim, I think that's a really good point that, it is a sad commentary on our society that the forest itself doesn't have a strong enough constituency. But the reality here is that we have to build the constituency amongst people who want to mitigate the risk of wildfire, who want the public health benefits, who value the job creation. I don't think there has been enough focus amongst the forest advocates in the state to branch out into all of these other issues where even if we can't necessarily measure all of the avoided costs, there are strong constituencies for avoiding wildfire. There are strong constituencies for not having the worst air quality in the Bay Area for 2 months of the year, every year for, forever from what we see. There's strong constituencies around having stability in the business climate and not having to have all the interruptions from wildfire and its impacts. And we really need to do a better job building that broader base. And recognizing that that's where the change is going to come. It's not just going to come from the forest advocate, And by the way, you brought up another really interesting issue that one of the existential threats to the biomass industry here right now is the bias for, essentially a bias on the part of some state players to essentially eliminate all combustion overall as a source of energy. Not just wood, but natural gas and others. That that is a great long-term ideal, but the path to getting there is going to be extremely difficult. And there is a struggle going on right now, particularly within the Air Resources Board, on what the direction should be. And that's going to be a tough debate in California, I think.
Well, Steve, you're right. The ARB and the Secretary of Cal EPA do have almost stated, but somewhat unstated, zero combustion goals, which doesn't bode well for biomass to energy in any form, not just electricity. And the argument that has to be made, that I've made in a few quarters, but not enough, is that that's the long-term goal. In the short term, we're burning the forest down on an almost daily basis now. And there are existing technologies that can give us some short-term benefits that, one pile burn destroys an awful lot of greenhouse gas One forest fire destroys a whole year's worth of that. So the limited emissions from a biomass to energy plant are peanuts compared to what we're trying to avoid. But that doesn't resonate well with some people who are just so committed to this idea that there are other technical solutions. But we all know how long it takes to bring some of those technical solutions to fruition.
I do think that there's a growing recognition amongst the business community, and somebody asked, how do you mobilize the business community around this issue? So number one, having the data that Allison's talking about to be able to demonstrate what the investment in forests actually means as far as carbon reducing activities, and using that to engage the business community to get them to invest in that strategy is one really important component of that, especially since so many Fortune 500 and California companies have made commitments to try to achieve carbon neutrality in their operations and in their investments in the long term, right? But there's a whole nother element of the business community that is just beginning to speak up now about the cost of business interruption, bad air quality, and other impacts from wildfire that are really important. I think it's significant that the California Economic Summit and California Forward, which is essentially a business organization, came on board with these recommendations for forest funding this year, as did the California State Association of Counties. So there's beginning to be this coalescence between business, local government, and the environmental community and the climate adaptation community around a similar objective. And that's actually, part of my reason for optimism. But you're right, it's going to be tough to overcome some of the inherent biases in our system against certain forms of energy, quite frankly.
But you're right, the private sector needs to be brought into this more deeply, because they do exercise political clout, and it can offset some of the internal biases that I don't think some of the highest level leaders in the state historically have recognized, that not all their dots are connected in support of some of these things, and some agencies get to pursue their own agendas beyond what's reasonable with regard to other things that need to be taken care of. And I am criticizing my own Energy Commission, where I spent over 10 years. I'm definitely criticizing the PUC, who was given the responsibility, sadly, many years ago, to conduct the study of the economic benefits of co-benefits and avoided costs. And when that decision was made, I almost begged on my knees, do not give it to the PUC, give it to some academic institution, give it to anybody but the PUC. But they did, and I think we lost a decade of trying to make that point. So now that I'm out of government, I can criticize. And I
think there's another constituency that's really important too, which is the point that a lot of people, and most notably disadvantaged communities and vulnerable populations, are being affected by the wildfire situation. It is essentially low-income people who don't have the capacity to adapt to this change. They can't get in their car and drive to Tahoe to get out of the smoke. They can't not work in the field. They can't not conduct their daily business because they're living day to day. And that constituency, essentially vulnerable communities, disadvantaged communities, and people who really are being affected by the public health impact, need to be part of the solution as well. And that is one area in California where we're seeing a lot of investment flowing into trying to address those vulnerable population and disadvantaged community issues. We need to make alliances there, and we have not been able to do a very good job of making those alliances,
So we only have a few minutes left, and I'm, Stacey, going to turn it over to you in moments, but I just want to ask you both, you've said many one things. If you could, as succinctly as you are able, articulate the thing, if you could put all your weight, all your muscle power, all your energy into one change, one solution, one thing that might happen, what might it be? And there's a comment from Jonathan in the chat box, which I think may be addressed by this answer. And if it's not, Jonathan will directly address it. What is the one thing? Patrick?
That's a tough one. I'm not, it's funny you warned me you were going to ask me this question, and then I completely dropped the ball on
Want me to tell you what you said to me at the time?
What's that? What did I say to you at the time?
You talked about the management and execution of restoration projects at the ground level.
Yeah, no, I do think the push which is beginning right now to make regional frameworks the focus as opposed to top-down work by state and federal agencies, to me it's going to be the key for the next decade of making progress on this issue. Is and it deals with a lot of the issues we just talked about, where you've got PUC over here, and you got the Air Board over there, and you got the Energy Commission over there, and you got Resource Cal EPA, and the region is where all that can come together. Because candidly, you're not going to change overnight all those cultures that Jim just talked about among the agencies. They're going to be in their stovepipes. And so the way to align, to get back to your very first question when we started at 3:30, the way to align is not going to be to get the Air Resources Board and the Energy Commission and the Resources and CAL FIRE on the same page, because they're not going to get on the same page. The way to align is to align regionally. So you get money from ARB over here because they've got a cap and trade program. You get money from CAL FIRE over here, and you get some money over here. If you wait for the state and federal agencies to align, even though that's my job right now, is to write a report that aligns them, you know, we're trying to coordinate. I wouldn't say align, but coordinate. The way to get aligned and integrated is at the regional level. That's the one thing.
And then enable those regions to execute the restoration work on the landscapes that they manage. Fantastic, thank you. Steve.
Wow. So we make the assumption that we have a technological solution to a natural problem. If I could change one thing, it would be for us to de-emphasize the technological solutions and to shift to natural land management solutions. And the only thing that can achieve that is strong, committed, persistent executive leadership that recognizes the problem and directs kind of agency and leads the public in the cultural change necessary to get there. And much as it pains me to say this, I really do not believe we have that executive leadership in the state today. And I think that's a problem. Like, everyone talks a mean game about wanting to achieve these long-term climate goals, but they're fooling themselves that the solutions are going to be essentially emitting a little bit less of the bad stuff we emit. Like, that is not the long-term solution. The long-term solution is adapting our landscapes to actually function the way they are supposed to function to capture and sequester carbon. And that includes forested landscapes and wetlands and estuaries and agricultural lands and everything else. And I think making that change to really fully internalize a natural and working land strategy that is at least as important as the technological strategies is the kind of big change that we need.
Thank you. Stacy. You want to take it away?
Wow. Teal, thank you so much for your facilitation. And Patrick and Steve, we are so lucky to have both of you in our community with the experience that you have, the wisdom that you bring to the table, the relationships, the vision. I'm so grateful for what you both do and just feel really lucky to have listened to this conversation between the two of you. It was just powerful. And Jim, your insights as well are very much appreciated. And so I would like to end with this, and I'm going to ask everybody who can. I know that some people are probably having dinner with their families right now. We are past the 5 o'clock time. So, but if you can hear me and you're still on and you can turn your camera on, I'd love to see some faces as we close out our final salon for 2020. Oh, I love this. Thank you so much for doing that. And I just want to say there are a lot of people on this call who have been speakers. There are a lot of people on this call who have been community members who have been attending these over the course of the last year and quite frankly 3 years. There are a lot of people on this call who have given their time and their dollars and their voices to this work. And I just want to thank you. We are the change agents, and some of us have been further along in our change agent lifetime, and others are just coming onto the scene. And I hope you will continue to use these salons as an opportunity to connect with each other, to continue to learn from each other, and just keep that forest health, which at the end of the day is really the commonality for all of these conversations and co-benefits and avoided costs, et cetera, et cetera. We love the forest. It is it's an important part of who we are and our planet. And so thank you. I hope you have a wonderful holiday and holidays. I look forward to seeing you in the new year. We look forward to sharing the lineup for 2021. It's very exciting, somewhat controversial. I'm kidding. Maybe not. But it's going to be fun. And so I really hope to see everybody at our next salon and some of you in between. And just reach out. We keep connecting. So just keep reaching out, keep sharing your story. And if you have ideas and if you want to be more engaged in this conversation, let us know. We'd love to hear your thoughts, and we'd love to, think of new ways of doing this kind of work. So thank you so much. Again, Teal, Robert, to the board of TTCF, to the staff of TTCF, thanks for all you guys do.
Thank
All right.
you, Stacy, for
Thank
hosting.
you.
So fun.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Everybody.
Good work.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Keep it up.
everyone.
Keep it up.
Cheers.
Thank you. Cheers.
Steve, let's talk.
Angie, thank you always for your great questions.
I know. Who knew you were? I asked Emily Vitus if she knew you because, she's from Auburn. And she said y'all hadn't met yet.
Oh, we'll have to connect. I'm coming out for the Christmas and New Year's break, so.
I'm happy to make a connection for you. I don't know that anybody's getting together, but at least you'll know another Auburn local.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Okay.
Thank you. And thanks for
Yeah.
these discussions. Can't wait for the new year. There's just so much.
Safe travel.